Hi everyone, good evening. We're recording this episode live from Frigo Vert on Concordia's downtown campus. I'm Sydney Sheedy. I'm an independent researcher and I've been in Montreal since 2010. I finished my PhD at Concordia last year and I study the revival of magic and occultism in queer movement building in Montreal, specifically in terms of heritages of race, empire, and settler coloniality. And I'll be facilitating with Piper the live session with our wonderful guest today.
Hi, my name's Piper. If you've listened to this series at all, you might already be aware, but I'm a musician, artist, former Concordia student, currently living in what's currently known as Montreal, but also historically and currently known as Tiohtià:ke, Mooniyang. And I have been working on this series with Sydney, looking back at the last 50-ish years of student activism here in Montreal and specifically at Concordia, where I also completed my master's degree around this time last year in the communications department. And it's been really great bringing that background to this series, and super excited to be talking with our wonderful guests here today who will introduce themselves in just a moment. Okay, so yeah, maybe going around the circle this way.
Great. My name is Maya. I was a Concordia student back in 2013. Was a part of CREW, the Concordia Research and Educational Workers Union. We led a re-affiliation campaign to join the CSN and win a better and stronger union.
Hi, I'm Becca Wilgosh. I forgot to say my name on our episode, but I'm also from the CREW reaffiliation campaign. I'm still a CREW member, and I'm doing a PhD at Concordia right now.
Hi, I'm Aaron Lakoff. I guess I was talking a lot about my history at Concordia going back about 20 years. I'm from Montreal originally, didn't grow up here, moved back to the city in 2002, the week before the Netanyahu riot. So maybe we'll talk about that a bit after. And so I've been involved in anti-Zionist Jewish activism for a long time. Most recently, I worked for a few years with Independent Jewish Voices, doing communications with them. And I've been involved in a lot of different anarchist community organizing, independent media over the years. I used to be the news director at CUTV. Here I'm just pointing because the studio used to be right down there. People on the radio can't see pointing. And I used to work at CKUT radio as well too, so it's always lovely to be on community and campus radio. And I'm currently working in the labor movement for the Public Service Alliance of Canada. Won't say anything about CREW except for unions should be in total solidarity with each other, and love the work that student labor activists are doing here.
Hi, my name is Angelica. I'm a fourth-year undergrad here at Concordia still. I'm at ASFA, which is the union that represents arts and science students at Concordia. I'm the academic coordinator there, and I was interviewed on the episode about general anti-austerity and the tuition hikes.
I'm Juliana Smith. I am the CSU's campaigns coordinator, so I work for the socio-political arm of the student union. I've been involved in a number of student movements at Concordia going back to 2019, but on the podcast I spoke about the accreditation drive, and I also spoke about the Me Too movement at Concordia.
Thank you. I'm Ali Salman. I was in the McGill encampment episode, which I believe was the 8th one. I was a McGill media rep, McGill encampment media rep. I'm also part of the Concordia Student Union, and I organize within the Palestinian movement here with PYM.
Awesome. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. And for those of you who haven't listened to the whole podcast, everyone who you just heard from is really great to interview, and there's lots of great snippets from all of them over the last 9 episodes we've done. So just to start off, we're going to do kind of popcorn style. And the first question that I want to ask you is, generally, what is it like to be a student activist here? Is there something particular about Montreal that produces a certain kind of culture, a set of priorities, intentions? How do you want to speak to that? You can also speak to maybe if you understood there being a legacy that already existed before you arrived in the city and how that influenced you? Kind of take the question where it feels right.
I'd love to go. I believe that Montreal is like what is known as Montreal is one of the most active student. There's a lot of student movement here in Montreal historically, whether it's 2012 strikes, even the 2002 Netanyahu riots, and now with the Palestinian movement. And I believe that this is something very important in a city, to build a very successful movement that will get us places. It got us places here at Concordia, with the student movement being very strong, with the strikes happening for the first time for Palestine, with the SGM vote that passed with the overwhelming majority, and with all the faculties and unions that are currently mobilizing for BDS. We've seen this unprecedented mobilization around BDS and around Palestine. It has become such a prominent issue. And that is partly because of how much history there is in student movements here in Montreal, which is great.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating. I've been born and raised in Montreal, and it's really interesting looking back as how organizing and just people kind of getting up, taking a stand against things that they're passionate about has always been ingrained in the fabric of Montreal and Quebec's culture. The history of the student movement, as Ali said, is very, very rich. When I got to ASFA, I worked on a timeline, especially for tuition hikes. And the first student strikes date back to, I think, the 50s and 60s. So it's something that's always been around. And I remember, I don't want to, make anybody else here feel old, but I think I was in 3rd or 4th grade when the 2012 strikes were happening. Sorry. And I just remember going to school, and I didn't hear anything bad from any adults in my life, whether that was educators, daycare monitors, parents, or guardians. Everybody was 100% in support of the strikes, of the protest. I kind of remember the pots and pans rally when Shahi kind of banned assembling, which was really cool. It was cool to have been there. But being raised in Montreal, kind of that civil disobedience is kind of something that's trained into you. And it's really cool.
And I think, I had the perspective of starting at McGill when I first started here, and then being a proud McGill dropout. I only lasted a year and a half. And I dropped out for a bunch of reasons, but one was, like I said, I'm from Montreal originally, grew up in Toronto, and I moved back here precisely because I was excited by the very rich cultural fabric and tradition of activist organizing in Montreal. And my whole family's from Montreal. We've been here going back to the 1800s, and waves of Jewish immigration that, fled pogroms to come here to the city, and kind of, built up a lot of the schmata business, as they call it, the sweatshops up Saint Laurent. And so, I kind of identified with this certain history of Montreal. And then I arrived at McGill and I remember being very frustrated because, there were and there are student activists at McGill, but at the time, and I really hope McGill has changed, is that it felt extremely conservative, right? It just felt, and it is literally walled off from the rest of the city, right? I wanted to be in Montreal to be part of this rich cultural fabric, and I didn't want to be stuck in this island where, no offense to anyone who's a unilingual Anglophone, but it's a lot of people weren't even trying to communicate with the rest of the city. And that's not what I see now, because I think, talking about the Palestine encampments, I'm the parent of a toddler. So it's funny for me, because I would love to be doing more these days, instead I'm just trying to figure out how to survive one potty training episode to the next. And I got to take my kid down to the McGill encampment one day, and he had a great time. But I think one really cool thing to come out of that movement was seeing how UQAM and Concordia and all of the universities got together and built up this movement. And so I think we're seeing a lot more of that happening. When I switched over to Concordia, and I'll just wrap up on this point, I was excited to come here because I think the geography of Concordia too is interesting. It's a downtown campus, and it's not walled off in the same way that McGill is. So I think in that way, it just kind of blends in a much more organic way with the city in general. And in that sense, like Concordia just picks up on all these rich histories that you guys got into in the podcast, like the computer riots and the Netanyahu riots, and name the other riots. But yeah, I'll just leave it.
It's me. I'm the problem. I don't speak French.
That's not.
But I'm not unilingual. Yeah, I'm not from Quebec. I moved here to do my PhD, so it's sort of a different perspective, I suppose. One maybe Maya shares, but and I think what really struck me coming here was there's so much that has already happened and already been done that we're doing again. And that we're just repeating, and that we're seeing the same problems and the same actions from the institution over and over. And like that really struck me in the episodes as well, to just see those parallels. So it was a great and rich history to learn from, but it's also a challenge for the type of organizing that we do, because we're students, because we are usually only here for, 2 to, in my case, maybe 6 or 7 years. We have to learn all of those things, but then also teach them this mountain of information and experience to incoming people. And it's so challenging. And then to be in this Anglophone place that's maybe disconnected in some ways from the rest of the city and the province's politics can be challenging. And I guess, I've lost my last point. I'll pass it on and maybe we'll come back to it later.
One thing I just wanted to add, I think I share a similar perspective to Becca in the sense that I'm not from Montreal. I also came here. I think my first introduction to Quebecois culture was when I was in the 8th grade, and that was 2012. So, I'm not quite as young as Angelica, but I'm still pretty young relative to a lot of the organizers that run in these spaces. And coming in May at the height of the strikes after Bill 78 had been passed, and being exposed to that culture, coming from my tiny little East Coast town, I was like, whoa. And it opened my eyes up to the world of possibilities. And I think that's what Montreal is about. I think listening back to the podcast has been really interesting because none of what we are seeing right now comes out of nowhere, if that makes sense. Maybe that's too redundant in a way to frame it, but it all exists because of the history of student activism here. And I think that if I were to put a name to it, it comes down to combative unionism. And as someone who works with student organizers and is trying to pass down this institutional knowledge from past generations of organizers to future student organizers, that is kind of the synthesis of what I'm trying to say, is to look into the spirit of combative unionism, look at autonomy, look at direct action, look at, I'm forgetting the third tenet, but these are all really core things that student organizers need to understand and be able to have in their toolbox of how to move forward and continue to present a sustained counterforce to the university administration.
I've remembered. Okay. Thank you, Juliana. You reminded me. No, I guess the last thing I was going to say on this is about being a student activist, because I think we're uniquely positioned as student worker activists. And in terms of the legacy, we've heard a lot about the legacy in Montreal of the student movement and the support for Palestine and civil disobedience, but I kind of want to give a shout out to the Common Front, which was just an incredible thing to behold coming from other parts of Canada where unionization is below 25%. And to see such a huge proportion of the population across the public sector on strike together is so motivating and so cool. So that's definitely something that draws us together in Montreal.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something we've heard come up across all of the episodes, is this legacy of activism, unionism, and specifically student activism and the strong student unions that Quebec has, how that has helped shape the face of student activism and broader activism in Montreal, and how that legacy kind of perpetuates itself. People move here, maybe because they want to be more politically involved or they want to be part of that legacy, and they see what's come before and they build on it. And so on that, I'm wondering if you can all speak to how you think tactics have shifted over time, or, you know, what stayed the same, what's kind of been the through lines.
Creativity and the different tactics that the student movement has taken over time. And to me, there's always been this kind of tongue-in-cheek cheekiness to the student movement that I really appreciate. More recently, in 2015, there was the CATS campaign, which is Concordians Against Tribunals, that was against the use of academic tribunals of student activists that had participated in anti-austerity strikes. And one of my favorite things about that movement is they used a lot of creative tactics that were themed around cats. So they would have cat masks on when they did banner drops. They would leave litter boxes around the university for the university president. And I think we can see that in almost every iteration of the student movement is kind of this aspect of play that's also being brought forward. And I think that's something that helps to sustain our movements and also, I don't know, engage people and bring them forward in different ways, make it more accessible to people.
Well, maybe to speak a bit more about the student worker perspective. So, for example, when I joined the university in the philosophy department, we had a professor in our department with a long history of sexual harassment allegations over a long period of time. And when I arrived, what had already been tried as a way to address this was through the student association. So, you know, do a public letter, kind of shame the administration in order to, you know, do something about it. But that hadn't really gotten anywhere. And this is partially because it was quite small scale. So when I arrived, and people were kind of, everyone passed on this information, you know, the next generation to the next generation, we were kind of confronted with the question, well, what are we going to do? And perhaps the way that we adjusted compared to other generations was to deal with it as a labor question. Dealing with it insofar that when you join the university as a master's student, you're often assigned teaching assistant contracts, and we were assigned teaching assistant contracts to this person. And so we decided collectively that we would all refuse to work with this person until a set of demands of ours were met. And how that, I think, differentiates from the previous ways of doing things through the student association was that we were really utilizing our labor power in the university. And I think that's pretty specific to how the university has developed. The population of student workers has about doubled in the last 10 years. And that's because the university is increasingly relying on casualized labor, which is in one sense pretty bad because it means that it's far more difficult to organize. And it also means people have far worse conditions. It also means conditions for learning being degraded by people being on just contract to contract. But it also has led to a lot of different opportunities like these ones. It also, it has meant that there are a lot more student workers, and that means that as students, we have a lot more labor power in the university than we did 10 years ago, and it means it's increasingly more powerful to use it, not just for economic gains in terms of wages and so on, but also for political gains, which was what we were trying to do in the department. So in that sense, I think there has been a shift towards trying to use the labor power of students more efficiently, not just in Concordia, like we're not the first people to have imagined this, but in the United States, this process of casualization in the university sector has been just spiraling out of control. And that's really where a lot of the teaching and research assistant unions started and proliferated, and we're really just following that. But that shift is taking place here as well, and it also means, as we can see there, lots of strikes in teaching and research assistants. We can copy those strategies and we can start applying them effectively here.
I think from a student union perspective as well, social media has really changed the way that we organize and kind of inform our membership. When we started organizing the tuition strikes last year, we really did try to model ourselves around the way it was done in 2012. So, you know, the essay, you know, kind of building a broader coalition, convincing all the members of those coalitions to kind of go on strike at the same time. And within ASFA, we're one faculty union that has 33 sub-unions under it. And usually when we decide to go on strike as ASFA, we do the annoying thing and ask all of our sub-unions to go on strike individually, which is kind of just to address the individual pedagogical needs that every department has in a faculty that's as diverse as arts and science. But what I saw when I was kind of coordinating what was 30 strike votes at the same time was was how useful and also annoying the internet has kind of become in kind of political movements. Memes are great at mobilizing people, but at the same time, when we were out on the ground saying, hey, come to your General Assembly, we either heard, well, if it's not on Instagram, I don't know about it and I don't care, or I heard the other, why do you use Instagram? I'm 40, I have kids, can you send me an email? So kind of trying to exhaust all of those channels and discover all of those social media channels and synthesize it in a way that was accessible to most people. And the way strikes have kind of changed as a result of the digitization of education, what happened. And I think this is a direct result of the pandemic and how the university kind of adapted to shifting learning online during the pandemic, was they kind of just brought that back during the strikes. I'll never forget the second tuition strike back in January. The first time somebody ran up to me and said, this prof is holding class on Zoom, what do we do? And I just froze because I didn't know. We kind of said Zoom bomb or join and try to lecture the prof as to why this is scabbing. And a lot of professors either didn't understand why holding a Zoom class constituted as crossing a picket line, or why posting an online lecture also constituted as crossing the picket line. So I think in contrast with how strike movements looked, back in 2012, we now have this added element of, okay, how do we fight Zoom? How do we fight the fact that content can now just easily be posted online? What does the suspension of academic labor look like in an age where we've kind of just been expected to be producing academic labor under any circumstance at all times?
I can jump on here. I'd love to speak more about digitization as something that's changing the tactics, but also the way that we organize in very challenging and interesting ways. From the labor perspective, our power comes from getting people to show up, to know each other and act together and be willing to be on a picket line and cause a disruption, a physical disruption to the university's function. And I think the student strike shares that tactic. And it's simultaneously easier to reach people because we have many different ways to find them. We can find them on social media. We can find them in email. We can get them on a hybrid meeting if they live really far away and they can't come here. And it has opened up all these great things for accessibility. And at the same time, it has really made it so difficult to get people to show up because it's so easy to do the low stakes, low participation, doing things in person and getting in the way is really scary. And trying to do them from far away online feels good, but doesn't contribute to that. And this is sort of a difficult tightrope to walk when you're doing organizing because you want people to be included and engaged, but you also want them to be there. And maybe others have more to say about this. I was particularly impressed, for instance, with the encampment and just the level of physical presence and commitment from the people who carried that out, in contrast with many, many meetings that struggle to turn out at least 50% in person, right?
I think I just want to jump in because it was I think a political moment in general in our area that was so revolutionary that people saw it and were very engaged in it. And I think these moments, purely revolutionary moments, are rare kind of to have. And I think this is the reason why people were very, very engaged. And I think it was a moment that's when we look back at it, the first few days of the encampment were so organic. It got a lot of people together, a lot of even people who were not politicized that I knew of were in the encampment. So it was a moment that was like, okay, wow, this unity is amazing. But I just want to touch upon the idea, the digitalization. I think that it is a tricky road to navigate, but it is also like it can be used obviously to our benefit. But I agree, like when it comes to strike, it's very hard for people to understand you touched upon it as well, what that Zoom is actually crossing the picket line. It is quite difficult to navigate. I agree. Maybe
just if I can add one thing about the use of digital media as a tactic in student movements. So it makes me think of the 2012 strike. And during that strike, so I just finished my undergrad the semester before, but then I got a job during the student strike at CUTV working as the news coordinator. And so I'm sure people in the room know this, but CUTV played a really central role in the student strike, which was really cool because the Anglophone universities, we're doing things, but we're still kind of on the sides, right? It was really like UQAM, UDM, and a lot of the Francophone universities that were heading the charge. And then, of course, like the neighborhood movements, which were so exciting to witness kind of a few months into the strike when things really got going and when Charest passed the special law banning protests. But CUTV basically started sending crews out every night. So there was nightly demos during the student strike, 8:30 p.m., Place Amélie Gamelin. It's like you knew where to be. And it was incredible because we would march for hours. Like no one had to work out. Like I didn't have a gym pass. It's just like, but you would walk all over the city. Some nights we'd walk up to Westmount to go to Charest's house way up on the hill. Like a lot of nights we'd end up way up by like Beaubien Metro, right? And there was never a planned route. They were just like totally spontaneous, anarchistic snake marches. I think it was definitely the most beautiful thing, or one of the most beautiful things I've ever witnessed and had been a part of. And to bring it back to digital media, CUTV was live streaming on our website. We were live streaming these protests, and it was kind of the early days of live streaming. Like you still couldn't live stream on Facebook or Instagram. iPhones were a thing, but I don't think they had the same kind of streaming capability. And so what we would do is we would send these crews out, and it was like this ridiculous setup. We would have a big camera, and then someone had to be carrying this like heavy backpack attached to the camera that had like 5 or 6 SIM cards in it that was like shooting the signal out into the world. But that platform became this really incredible way for people in the movement to talk to each other. So people would use it for all sorts of things. Like, for example, if you missed the 8:30 starting point and you wanted to find out where the demo was, you just log on to CUTV, be like, okay, they're roughly there. I'm going to hop on my bike. I know where to find the demo. People would document a lot of police brutality. And a lot of times it was like the crews at CUTV that we were getting pepper sprayed. I got arrested live on camera one night when we were like protesting the Grand Prix just right up on the corner there. Just like wild stuff that was happening. But it created this incredible centralized platform that I kind of wonder what it would be like today if there's a student strike. And I certainly hope there are more student strikes in the future, but like it's certainly a different thing when like everyone's pulling out their phone and live streaming versus like, okay, we all know to tune into this one platform.
Yeah, and if folks are wondering, you can find that video of Aaron being arrested.
It's on YouTube.
On the CUTV YouTube. I think we're going to go to a quick music break here, and then we'll be back to chat more. Welcome back. You are listening to a special live broadcast of Discordia, over 50 years of student activism at Concordia University, broadcasting live from Frigo Vert on the downtown Concordia campus. And we're joined by several wonderful guests who have been with us throughout the series. Sydney's going to ask them another question now.
Yeah, so far we've covered a lot. Just looking at my notes, some of the things I want to kind of maybe capture that I'm sure a lot of you were talking amongst yourself about during the break. One thing has to do with, someone brought up the sort of grief of reinventing the wheel, or just feeling like, especially for students, if you're only here for 4 years, it's kind of like, who do you learn from? Who do you mentor? How do you sort of maintain and pass down the knowledge that you work so hard to generate and sort of hold on to? And I'm wondering if any of you can speak more to that, and specifically if you have experiences of maybe finding out that there was a particular group or siloed off in a different part of the university that you had wished you could have collaborated with more, or finding a really great ally somewhere and that changing, or your experience of what it meant to organize. And I find, we're in such a huge university with so many different kind of interest groups, and we've spoken to about the splitting of the different unions and splintering of interests, and if any of you can speak to what kinds of collaborations are working or could work better in terms of finding that unity in this time, and in particular with respect to the kind of student activist experience of being generally so transient as well.
It is so frustrating, especially COVID was definitely terrible is a really flat line, terrible, like illiterate STEM student that needs a thesaurus word to put it. But like COVID was a disaster because any sort of institutional knowledge that we had built up just disintegrated. Because students that were around were organizing, were kind of gathering that knowledge and information, went home, and then everybody graduated. And I started at Concordia when we were just starting to get back onto campus, and it really felt like we all started back from zero. And it took a lot of work to kind of get back into the groove of things. I remember the academic coordinator that preceded me even hired an academic researcher, and their only research mandate was to go around and interview people, people that were kind of still around Concordia on their way out, people that were freshly out of Concordia, and just kind of gather that, what did you work on? What kind of actions were you a part of? Who did you work with? Just kind of retroactively piecing together what student activist life at Concordia looked like before we were all stuck on Zoom for 3 years. And then that kind of what I call, I guess, a freeze really stuck around until we started organizing around tuition, it kind of feels like, because that's really where all these bodies started talking to each other again. Like, that's where we all got acquainted with the other faculty associations. That's where ASFA and CSU really, I feel, solidified their political working relationship. And for the first 3 to 4 months of tuition organizing, we were so unbelievably siloed off. It felt like 3 or 4 groups were doing the same kind of work and working in the same direction and producing identical product, that by the time we all sat down at the table, we all felt as though we had been working very, very hard. And then we almost had nothing to show for it just because everybody had kind of done the same thing. And it just kind of took a while, but I think last year we really did build a really beautiful coalition between a couple of universities, and especially just within the bodies at Concordia, where I feel as though that, we're still kind of siloed off, especially I would say kind of the student side and then the worker side. And don't get me started on the faculty unions. We won't go there, but we're kind of slowly starting to work back around to that really well-oiled machine that is like a properly working university coalition. I think what works really well is the storytelling. I think getting together and doing stuff like this is very useful because not only is it an accessible resource, that the storytelling is very important, because there's no other way to concisely be able to sit somebody down and tell them the A to Z of how things happened. So we need to take time to do this. I think that's been done very well. But I think what we need to be doing more of, and I'll admit, somebody did call me a woman that has been around for too long. But I think another thing we need to do is kind of not necessarily make way for the new generation, but definitely kind of hang around that freshman orientation table a little bit more and bring people into the fold a little bit earlier and make student organizing something that doesn't seem so nebulous and scary, so that students can kind of come right into university, learn about it as quickly as possible, get involved, and maybe just kind of grease those wheels a little bit better.
And I think that's very important what you just said, because this is where I remember the tuition strikes, and I remember even the strike for the reading week, and I remember like these very like instances where people were trying to get the wheel going, and it was a bit difficult. And I also remember even BDS, like BDS has been around since ages ago. And I remember in 2022 when people found out that that's when Graham Carr went and signed the deal with Bar Ilan University, and they tried to do something about it. One of the things that they'd done about it, I remember, was put a letter in front of the poli-sci department, and that was it. And it was kind of like this struggle to get things going, even in the Palestine movement, and it eventually, with the genocide in Gaza, the movement came back, and people started remembering, like people from past activists who were part of different causes and different things. They came in and started getting involved, and they started automatically transitioning that knowledge to the activists in the Palestine movement, and this is how I think the movement the current movement, and I guess that kind of helped as well revive the faculties and the unions and make them properly work. And it's like the Palestine movement kind of took that knowledge and applied it, whether it's at strikes in Concordia or at McGill. McGill they did the strikes 2 weeks ago, and it was the first strike ever at McGill, and that's like these stuff that are changing history is well, partly the PDS movement and Palestine, and these stuff are what made past activists come in and teach us more, and I think that's very important, and we're fortunate to be living in that time.
And if I could just pick up on that too, because despite the despair I think that so many of us are feeling when we see what's happening in Gaza, I mean, there's no words anymore, but I think the movement around Palestine gives us life and gives us hope, right? Like, I always feel so blessed because I dropped out of McGill to go to Palestine. And I think being in Palestine when I was 21 years old, I learned how to be a human, like being with Palestinians, doing direct actions there, like they taught me. And like the fact that I went there, like openly Jewish, was welcomed into people's homes and fed, and stood up to Israeli soldiers and got tear gassed with everyone, like that experience, like there's just nothing in my whole life that's made me feel like more human than that. And I have like no doubt that we're going to win, like, especially when I see what's happening right now. And it's incredible, right? Because in 20 years, like in the 20 years since I started, right, doing this stuff. So I moved to Montreal, like I said, a week before the Netanyahu riot. I didn't go to the Netanyahu riot because I was like, I heard about it, but I also heard some stuff was going to go down, and I was like a little scared. And just like straight up, like coming from like a Jewish family, I think I was like scared to like out myself as an anti-Zionist or someone critical of Israel. But that all changed really rapidly in the months and years following the Netanyahu riot, because that opened up a huge space, even though there was so much repression. So for months after the Netanyahu riot, Concordia forbade any events discussing Israel or Palestine happening on campus, right? It's just this typical both sidesism. Oh, whether your event is about Palestine or about Israel, we're just not going to allow it, right? And you obviously you can surmise like which side that benefits, right? And I just think it's incredible because people stopped Netanyahu from speaking at Concordia, and there was an incredible climate of repression. And how I kind of got involved was there was a a student organization, a Palestinian student organization that founded in the aftermath. I think it was called, and sorry for my Arabic pronunciation, I think it was called Karame. And it was like just basically to defend people who were facing like deportations, right? And it's like we think about what Mahmoud Khalil is going through in New York right now. But there are students at Concordia who are being threatened because they were here on student visas, and then they're being threatened with expulsion. And so we're facing all the same issues. And, you know, this happens in 2002, and then you flash forward to last year when the International Criminal Court issues an arrest warrant for Netanyahu. And it's like, you can call it symbolic because we know it's like no Western government is going to ever enforce that. But it's incredible because student activists at Concordia issued an arrest warrant for Concordia when he came, and we're seeing this taken up at higher levels now. I mean, you mentioned BDS. Like, I was at the founding BDS conference in Canada in 2006, and then I was part of some of the first Israeli apartheid weeks that happened in Canada. And we could just never imagine at the time that the discussion would be able to get to the level of where it's at today, right? Like, and I think that, you know, don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot of pushing that needs to happen, right? Like the administrations are evil, and they're like the way they're clamping down on students. We're going to look back at this in 20 or 30 years, and we were joking about this before, right? But there's going to be some ridiculous Concordia event 30 or 40 years down the line where all the administrators are going to be talking proudly about how they divested from Israeli apartheid, just like they divested from South Africa apartheid. And you're like, you idiots, it should have been evident all along, right? But it's like, you know, just talking about like how like the generations have to keep in touch with each other because so many generations of activists who've been doing this work, whether it's the South Africa divest or divesting from Israeli apartheid or divesting from fossil fuels, like that work all builds on generations following. And sometimes it's so hard when you're in the moment, right, where it's just like you're being beaten by the cops, or you're being threatened with suspension or expulsion, and you're like, what is the way forward? But you have to remember that we're part of a legacy that sometimes takes many decades. But, you know, Palestine will be free, and we will have much freer institutions here where people can be free to learn and free to be themselves. And I think we need to remember that. Sorry, that was long-winded.
Okay. So I think I have an interesting role within the student movement where, because I'm a full-time staff member at the CSU, and I've been at the CSU like officially since 2020, so going on 5 years now, but I've been at Concordia since 2017. So I have the benefit of having seen this pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, post-pandemic, and then this new wave of student organizing that is unlike anything I've had the opportunity to witness, which is really exciting to see. And I as this host of this institutional knowledge, I feel like a lot of responsibility falls on me to be able to meet with current student activists and to be able to like pass on almost like this storybook of all of the legacies that have come before them, and to try to pass on as much of this knowledge as possible. And I think I'm at this place where I recognize that I'm not going to be in this position forever. This work isn't it's not sustainable by any means. And so I'm trying to figure out ways in which to like actually institutionalize that knowledge and to create like this written record. And so I think, like, again, going back to like the existence of this podcast, I think is fantastic for that kind of sake of documentation. We listening back to like the accreditation podcast and like the way that I think it was Sabine who was talking about the CSU archives and stuff like that. Like the CSU doesn't maintain archives anymore, and I've been pushing for the last 3 years for us to start maintaining archives because there's so much knowledge that doesn't get passed on. And I think it's so important to try to stop this recreation of the wheel, or whatever, however that goes. But the other thing I wanted to say about this is kind of going off of what Aaron and Ali said, is like pulling from this knowledge that already exists within the university, like something that at least we've been doing on the CSU side is like, especially because there is already a very recent framework for how we can divest from a certain sector. We've been doing so much to model our movement after fossil fuel divestment and kind of using the work that was done then to then create these inroads. Like, you know, at the time we were talking about sustainable sustainable investment, and they were like, okay, sustainable, that's green, that is all that sustainable means. And now trying to push them to shift to incorporate social sustainability that isn't just about Palestine, but it's about every other crime against humanity that's taking place in the world, which I know is a broad thing to try to force the world of investments to be able to address. But it has to start somewhere. And I think by laying that framework, I keep talking to student activists as like the work that we're doing now is you're looking at a chain of dominoes. And if in your time at Concordia, you can knock down one domino that then makes it easier to knock down the next domino for the next generation of student activists, I think that means something. And I think people need to be able to recognize that their role in the movement isn't just about achieving that end goal. It's about setting up the future for success as well.
Okay, yeah, I can speak to this a little more, although a lot of really good things have been said. It's not a direct answer to the question, I suppose, but I brought up this phenomenon of repeating and having the difficulties of turnover, in part because I listened to the episode about the computer science occupation. And I knew a little bit about it, but I didn't know a lot. And in listening to the accounts and like comparing it to my experience, especially the experience we've had trying to improve the sexual violence policy here and like building on the Me Too movement to grow it into a boycott that united students and workers together. Concordia's playbook hasn't changed in 50 years. It's the same. Like, correct me if I get the details a little bit wrong, but like there's always a problem of accountability where somebody is perpetuating sexism, racism, etc. within the university structure. There's a call out or a call to action to try and change that problem. We've seen that in the philosophy department with sexual violence. We saw it in the computer science department with racism. And then the people who are pursuing accountability are framed as threatening. And they're siloed into closed door committees. And they're told, we have to do it in this way because of privacy. And I believe someone quoted in the episode called it a kangaroo court, where people are put through tribunals for their student activism to try and paint us as threats for, pursuing justice in this area. And often it's met with a question about whether or not we should refuse to participate. The boycott of the SMSV committee, as well as the question that came to the student body, I believe, as in a vote at the end of the computer science occupation. I just see these parallels. And like going back into the Links archives, I don't know if anyone else has done this, you can like read back many, many years on their website and just like reading articles written 10, 15 years ago that could have been written now about the problems of sexual violence and how Concordia is dealing with them. Just like that type of thing is brain breaking. And I know that is a thing we're all struggling with. But I suppose the upside of it is, and this is sort of, I wasn't able to clarify this earlier, but like our university does things that are bad that radicalize the student body in ways that we don't see at other universities. And I think that in a sense is the silver lining. Like, yes, we have trouble passing on this institutional knowledge. We have to teach it over and over, and people come in and they have to learn it for themselves, but in a way that's good because there's not really any other way to learn it. You have to experience it to be radicalized, really. My question, I guess, and maybe we can come back to it, or maybe it's an unanswerable one, is what happens to people when they leave the university? Because we get radicalized here, we learn things, we learn how to fight, we have all these cool tactics. Where do we go? Like, where do we put our activism after we leave this structure that sort of gives us a shared target and gives us the many accumulated years of tactical experience? I would love to know if there's like a similar structure we could use to fight capitalism out in the world after. Anyway, I'll leave it there, but it's not all bad.
Yeah, I mean, does anybody want to speak to that?
Unions.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it the CSN?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, but I mean, to your point, I think like it's always interesting what experiences people take from student activism and where they take them into the quote unquote real world, right? Like I remember actually being really frustrated after the student strike with some of the student leaders who, we'd be like in press conferences with and marching with. And then they went on to run for parties, right? So like Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois, right, going into Québec Solidaire, the other guy, Blouin, running for the Parti Québécois. And it's like, okay, I have my own views on party politics. I'm not into them, but I at the same time, I'm like, there's a federal election coming up. We need to have a diversity of tactics and use whatever methods we can use to effectuate change. So if it's, voting in a candidate who's going to put pressure on stopping the genocide, or, protecting trans kids, like, we have to do that, right? But it's like, but there's also limitations. And I think I was frustrated at the time because we were seeing incredible energy coming out of the student strike and it was being recuperated by political parties. And I was like, this is not what people are striking for. It's not to build the ranks of Québec Solidaire or the Parti Québécois or the NDP. I also knew a bunch of student activists during the Orange Wave. When was that? 2012, when the NDP became the official opposition. People went from literally being, like on the air at CKUT to being on Parliament Hill, right? And again, this is not like I'm not trying to necessarily like slam those folks, but I think, I think if we want to like take the revolutionary energy that we have in universities, that honestly I could say, like, as a parent now, it's very hard to maintain those links with like radical organizing, and you miss being in it. But I think the labor movement is a way that people are, able to not only like fight for their own rights as workers. I want to give a huge shout out to like the 13,000 daycare workers, including my son's own daycare workers who are on strike right now, because you see the grind that people are going through in their day to day. And, you have a union, hopefully, that will not only stand up to fight for your rights as a worker, but also to like put some pressure on the government to have better policy on Palestine, or, have better policy around truth and reconciliation. So I think that like that's one logical step, but I also just want to come back to like the importance of archives too. Like I'm a huge archives nerd, and like we have to be documenting our experiences in any way possible, like knowing where they exist, right? Like you mentioned, the Link website is a great resource. At DIRA, which is the Anarchist Library on Saint Laurent, they also have an archive there. You can go through, radical anti-capitalist movements from the past decades. So preserving that memory, I think, is important in order to kind of like keep fueling our movements going forward.
I also want to add, this is something I've actually been doing a lot of reflecting on, because, I'm going to graduate soon, and if a grad school will have me, I'd like to go off to grad school, but I've been thinking about how I can take my organizing maybe outside of a school structure. And I've realized that one thing, especially that's rich about Concordia, I call Concordia like a micro society. If there's anything that happens in the real world, there's a version of it that happens at Concordia with the word Concordia in front of it. And, it's ultimately just that universities are pre-built communities. It's a group of people that share, you'll know that there's a sect of people within that community that shares an interest that you do. You want to talk to people, you want to, mobilize people around your cause. You can go canvas on the mezzanine, or you can come find people here at Frigo, or, you can go walk through the hallways of Evie. That doesn't, look, I live in suburbia. Gag, gasp, I know. There's nowhere to do that in suburbia, right? Like, what, I'm going to go door to door? You can't do that. People aren't very amenable to it, especially, not to bringing it up again, but after the pandemic, like, we've been so forced into our own bubbles that I think in order to kind of direct this radical organizing energy somewhere that is not what I'm going to call, for lack of better term, like a pre-built community, we need to start by just building a community. I have friends that live in neighborhoods like Point St. Charles that have Bâtiment Set. That's a phenomenal space for people that live in that neighborhood to be able to get together, come to this one common environment, and it kind of emulates what we have here at Concordia, which is, well, if I want to go talk to people, if I want to learn what people, in my space are up to and maybe we can all kind of organize around a problem that we've identified, that's a good place to start. But like libraries are dying, community centers are dying. Nothing is really, we're losing third spaces in this late stage of capitalism that we're in. So I think a lot of the energy, and it is frustrating to go from like organizing up here and like organizing encampments and doing a lot of DAs to maybe having to walk it back a little bit and start really small, which is just let me work with a couple really similarly motivated folks in my neighborhood to even just establish like a super accessible community space, and then maybe we can take it from there. So I think in my reflections, I know that that's what I'm going to try and do, just kind of like outside of my involvement in Concordia. I don't know if I'll be doing that in Dollars des Ormeaux, but any neighborhood I move to in this economy, I guess.
I've got two kind of thoughts on this. So I agree with the lack of third spaces, and I really agree with this idea of like the university as a microcosm of society. I think this is, I keep getting asked, and it's like, oh, like you're graduated, why are you still at the CSU? And I'm like, to be fair, I'm an Anglophone and no one wants to hire me. So that's point one. But then also I do really appreciate the university environment in the sense that I see it as this sandbox for people to be able to try out a lot of different things. And that's part of what universities are for. It's for research and, just thinking of new ways of existing. And I think that's true in terms of like the community organizing that we do. But the other side of the coin of student organizing, and I mentioned this previously, is it's deeply unsustainable work. And so I think part of what I try to impart on the students that I work with is like this idea that like when you're at a university, it's not just about being a student organizer and then you graduate and then you go work your corporate 9-to-5 job until you retire and you go forth with your life, whatever that is. No, it's like this is like an opportunity to learn, to grow your skills, and then to go on to be a lifelong organizer. How do we get to that point? And like, where do I direct those people to? I think obviously it's interest-based and I don't quite have an idea. But I think something I've been thinking about in light of like all of the austerity at Concordia is like Concordia is in a really bad financial state. Becca and I have this running gag of like, how long do we think it's going to take Concordia to shut down? And like, it's a pretty dark joke, but we're kind of like, oh, like what would we do if Concordia shut down, and how, things always shut down, but they're rebirthed in new ways. And so what could a potential reimagination of the university look like if Concordia were to shut down? What would it look like if maybe we had like the CSN and like the unions kind of like pitch in this funding to create this university that actually is this democratic, beautiful place that we imagine universities to be, but rather than serving corporate interests are actually motivated by this true desire to create knowledge and to build community.
Yeah, that makes me think immediately of what happened with the encampment at McGill last year and how quickly and how naturally people began programming like educational content in that space and treating it as, a free university in many ways, and how important it is, to sometimes bring that out of the actual academy. So I guess before we let you all off the hook, I wanted to ask what you feel is next and where is the urgency right now?
I think that, we are at a point where administrations are feeling this pressure. And I'm not just saying this to please like people listening, but it's true. Like when we see Concordia's administration intervene in the CSU, and then McGill do the same with SMU. I think what's next is for us to capitalize on these things, because it just proves to us that they're feeling the pressure and have concrete victories. One of these concrete victories this year was the strikes, and then the BDS motion at the CSU. I think that what comes next after this naturally is what you said, which is you believe we will win, and it's true, because what comes next after that, it's actually a concrete win. Despite the constant, going around the subject of Concordia's administration, I hear a lot from Concordia's administration, and it's funny because when they speak of the sustainability portfolio at Concordia, they're like, oh, well, it doesn't include weapons companies. But then you go and then you ask them about the partnerships, and they're like, well, we can't tell people not to have an internship. And you're like, okay, it's at Lockheed Martin, mate. Like, I don't know. Anyway, so I think concretely what goes next is actually achieving a victory, and it's gonna come. And I think people should be patient because it's right around the corner.
That's lovely. I suppose what I'm getting at is we all graduate from here, and we are then faced with the pressures of capitalism that take away this ability to organize as intensely as we do here. And we see people go on to do things like party politics and, to join the sort of the union bureaucracy or staff, which is not the same thing as being an activist and organizer. And we see many people go to NGOs, which I won't go into my personal beef with the NGOs, but it really is a unique experience. And I'm concerned with the way the university is heading, that fewer of us are able to dedicate that time to activism as funding crumbles and as more and more people are working jobs while studying. And I think to protect that ability to be a student and be all in and be temporarily a little bit free from the pressures of your job, that's where I want to see us focus our energy so that we can continue organizing in this space against the changes that will take away our ability to do so, and that will lead to future victories. And let's think about how can we extend that to the spaces that come after graduation.
Yeah, great. On Concordia's financial situation, which is apparently quite bad, but I also, I never believed this. I mean, when has a university said, our financial situation is great, and you know what? You can have as much money as you want because we're doing great. They've never said that. It's always a crisis. But in any case, if they don't have a lot of money, that just means they're weak, in my opinion. And this is what I thought throughout the whole crew negotiations. You don't have a lot of money. When a workplace wants to try to starve out striking workers, they save up all this cash, they save up all this equipment because they're like, we need to be able to survive a strike. They were on their hands and knees in a week begging people to come back to work because they don't have the cash. So in that sense, it's a great opportunity. It means that they have to be far more responsive to people's demands because they can't just bear it out for political reasons. If there is any economic disruption to their daily business, it's actually a huge problem for them, and it means that they're going to have to give up other concessions pretty quickly. So I just want to say that bodes very well for next year. Fight hard and you really might win. I think more broadly, though, there are, a lot of things going on with the CAC right now, especially when it comes to changes to strike clause, like the current anti-strike laws. This is just one chip away. Currently, at the moment, they're trying to make it harder for workplaces to strike, essentially. And this is just one more attack. And then after that, it's going to be attacking unionization and closed shop unions in Quebec. And then after that, so on until we Americanize the labor model here, which will really drive down unionization rates and make it much, much harder for people to fight in their workplace, which is after university where people spend most of their lives. And so is the most natural place to organize people, in my opinion. So fighting these political fights, I think, is going to be really important over the next year. It's a bit of revenge for the success of the public sector strikes, which were quite successful, relatively speaking. The next CAC government, if there will be one, any next government will be afraid of what that United Front could achieve. So, I don't know, Avinia?
I think what comes next especially is really harnessing the energy that we've created right now. A lot of people are really tuned in, both inside and outside the university. I think my parents are two of the most neoliberal people as they come. They're kind of dialed into the news, but when I go off the protest, they look at me like I'm going off to war, and they're like, if you see a police car, run away. And over breakfast yesterday, my mom was talking about like breaking windows if Pierre Poilievre got arrested. And while I know that she was joking and being a little bit cantankerous, I think there genuinely is, just within the greater Canadian population, this kind of sense of being fed up. Like, we talk a lot about organizing that's happening within Concordia, but, you know, Canada as a whole is kind of in this really weird chokehold right now. Like, the orangutan in the apartment underneath us is really going crazy. And I think like the average Canadian is really feeling the squeeze, and I'm noticing it starting to radicalize people I never thought could be radicalized before. And I think it would be interesting if we saw the people in these university spaces, especially like young students that are already really radicalized and kind of know how to organize, go off into like their own communities and radicalize their parents or radicalize their bosses or their neighbors, and see if we can maybe take this kind of beautiful coalition building that we've learned how to do at Concordia and see if we could apply it elsewhere. Because as we've just heard, right, like our right to unionize in Quebec might soon be under attack, but you know, so will our right to live. Like, our economy's not doing well. Our both candidates, all three candidates kind of that are up for election, kind of have conflicting views on what our best interests are, but I personally don't believe that any of them really have our best interests in mind. And it does feel kind of hopeless as an individual to wake up and read the news every day. And sometimes I wonder if you know, I should just dial up Putin and ask him to drop the nukes, because I've like had enough. But I do think that, as nebulous as it feels, we can build something really beautiful with the momentum that we already have.
Yeah, I mean, I think just like one of the reflections I have, it's funny. I find myself sitting here being very like wistful, thinking back to like my younger years of like having all this time as a student to like go to meetings and go to demos, and you know, I'm thinking very much about like where I'm at in my life. I'm 41 years old. My kid is 3. We, you know, my family, we got evicted from our cheap apartment last year, and you know, our living costs doubled, and we have to hustle and work all the time to make ends meet. And like living under capitalism can be so draining and dredging, and you know, but we wake up every morning, we try to maintain hope that, like, again, that we will win, because like I believe it, you know, like I want to see that future for my kid, for all the kids of Palestine, like for all kids everywhere in the world. We need that, right? But I think like, and I wish I had thought this a little bit more when I was a student activist, is like the importance of building intergenerational movements, right? Like, it's fun. I'm like, I don't want to be like the elder of the conversation, because I'm still learning so much from like my movement elders. But I think that our spaces are always richer when we have people of all generations, because like I get so inspired by seeing like what CJLO students and what like university students are doing these days. And then you know that like all of the blood, sweat, and tears that you put in when you're a student weren't for naught, because other people are picking up the torch. And like I think I'm lucky to be here tonight, because I have an awesome partner who was like, I'll take the kid, don't worry, go. But you know, it's yeah, like just like making sure that like we're always thinking about our spaces, like how can they be as accessible as possible, not only to different generations, but like different abilities, gender presentations, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would really hold on to that. And then the last thing I'll say is that like I really hope that we do a lot of thinking about how to fight fascism really seriously in the next few years, because it's so scary. And it's like, obviously what's happening in the US is scary. And then there's a potential of having a far right government here too. It might not happen, but regardless, it's like that's something that we need to grapple with a lot is yeah. And I think that in order to fight fascism effectively, we need strong, autonomous, anti-capitalist grassroots movements.
I'm glad that you brought up fascism, because I think was kind of the elephant in the room with this last question. Is like, at the end of the day, we are seeing the rise of the far right and encroaching fascism, not just from the States, but also all across Europe and in our own country. And, you know, just the fact that we're probably not going to have a far right government, the fact that that's even on the table right now is an element of concern, and it should be something that is present in our minds. I think looking down at what's going on in the States and kind of this new wave of McCarthyism around Palestinian organizing, and how, you know, Canada and the United States are just like Concordia and McGill, and they like to piggyback off of one another and copy each other. And so I do have some very serious concerns about what things are going to look like here in the next couple of years. And I think if we're to look at what is the most pressing thing for us to organize around, I think that's it. It's that repression. It's fighting fascism, because that taps into every other struggle that's on the table right now. And I think that really needs to be where people are putting their energy and trying to figure out what a concentrated coalition is going to look like trying to put that together. And I haven't figured that out either. So I certainly don't have the answers, but that's where my mind is at right now.
I think we're going to have to wrap up there for the portion of this episode that is with our guests. We're going to go to a music break, and I think then we'll have just a couple minutes of Piper and I wrapping it up. I think Cam has a couple of questions for us. So thanks for tuning in, and we have a few more minutes until 8:30 live from Frigo Vert.
My name is Cam. I am the program director here at the station. And for this last little segment, I will be interviewing Piper and Sydney. Piper and Sydney, how do you feel about the project and how it's going so far? You're about right at the end here, but how is it?
I can start. I mean, a great time to ask, because I think we just had a really great discussion. I'm still kind of absorbing everything that was said, but I'm just feeling really grateful to everyone who is in this space. We talked a lot just in the last section there about like learning from others and like intergenerational learning, which I think, at universities is 4 years. There's kind of a joke in the queer community that like an intergenerational relationship is like 5 years difference, in which case I am in one. And then, like this kind of, I guess what I mean to say is like, I'm very grateful to learn from and alongside the people who are in this room and other activists. And that's sort of like what, motivated me to come onto this project. Cause I think it's such a nice kind of way to like dovetail with the stories that are happening, and the kind of, if you feel like I feel like I am consistently feeling like alienated from forms of mentorship that maybe like once were sort of built into our like families or communities or like places that we grew up, and the campus is like one place where that can happen, and it's not a given. So feeling really great about what has managed to sort of materialize through the like hard work of not only people, being out in the streets and being activists and like answering emails and going to people and flyering and all that stuff, but also, being generous with their time about like talking about the experience and what has gone well and the limitations and all that. So feeling feeling very humbled by my experience as someone who's been sort of piecing the words together.
Yeah, it was really wonderful to bring so many of our guests together tonight and have them in the same room and able to respond to each other and not just like isolated to their specific episodes, because if you listen back through the episodes, you'll hear so many of these kinds of same themes and struggles and tactics and motivations coming up time and again. And, whatever the issues are that are being faced, there's always these through lines, especially when we're looking at student movements. And really grateful, to have been able to work on this for CJLO. Like, I've been kind of in and out of campus community radio for the last 12 years. It's always been really important to me. And, I go to protests and I talk to my friends and I talk to my family and all these things, but getting to actually be in conversation with people in my activist community here in Montreal, and then, produce it into these episodes and share it has just felt really good. And I definitely feel really privileged to be able to do that and to have, this kind of archive of what has the last 50-ish years of student activism in Concordia looked like, and to know what the legacies are that we're building on. So I think that's important.
Yeah, I was mentioned earlier in the hour how important as an activist being part of a legacy is, because it's what ultimately gives you the context and the tools and the abilities to do effective work. And from my listening experience, I like to think this podcast is quite the tool to at least speed up that learning journey. But now that you've completed the podcast, I want to ask you your expert opinion about what sets student activists apart from other activists, and what are the strengths of the student movement as opposed to other movements.
Yeah, I was thinking about this just with some of the conversation we had tonight, but then also, of course, over the past 6 months, because I think as we've talked about a bit tonight, there's something particular about what can happen in student movements that I think really just comes down to having time and being in a space where learning is promoted, and you're okay, I'm actually intentionally supposed to be in a learning space, and what can having attention on things do. And I think for most of us, if you actually are able to, when you start paying attention, you start to be on the side of history or whatever that student movements often are. And I think that that's not the only way to be radicalized, as we've talked about, once you stop having your basic needs met, or your attention is forced on things, then that is also a form of radicalization. But I think student activism does so often tend to be kind of at the vanguard of the left, because there is there's almost a way of uncoupling yourself from some of the affiliations you might have, especially in this era of identity politics, and almost becoming a bit more of an affiliation just as a student, if that makes sense. And that can create a kind of sense of unity where maybe there isn't normally. And it's interesting that in this era of neoliberalization, like Becca and Maya were talking about, there's a shift from the student not being just kind of a student anymore and being more of a student worker, and how that creates some opportunities to access forms of strike tactics or think of the potentials of activism through more of a class lens. But I think students generally kind of always exist, have a bit more of a class consciousness, because they're in this stage of not making a salary really, and being in this place where they're spending a lot of money and to do something, and therefore that kind of creates this consciousness that they're in service of something else that is not necessarily career driven. And I think that from that flows a lot of maybe more creativity or openness to actually asking the questions of what matter or what makes a livable life. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I think that the actual environment of the campus is also really important to what makes student activism so potent. Thinking of my own trajectory, in my life, I grew up in a really small town. I was not exposed to the most radical ideas. Well, maybe I would say they're radical in a bad way, but I moved into a smaller city as a teenager, and my high school was on the Queen's University campus in Kingston, Ontario, and I was spending time at CFRC, which is the campus community radio station there, and I was suddenly being exposed to all of these new ideas, new to me, and really just opened my eyes and broadened my world in such a way that then, going to university just continued. And I think there was really something about stepping onto the campus and being surrounded by people who pretty much across the board are just there to learn and are there to kind of, have an open mind and be a sponge for information and think critically and really kind of figure out who they are in the world. I think that space and that time for that is really important. And, there's definitely something to being like young and energetic and enthusiastic in your life as well. And it is, I think like Erin was commenting on this, like as you get older and you have to like work harder and you have mouths to feed, and it can be harder to hang on and to find the energy to keep going in activism. And I think, it came up tonight, like it's so important to make space for keeping people who are, not students anymore, like keeping older generations and our activist elders like in those spaces and in the conversation, and the importance of that. But yeah, I think what sets student activism apart is really just kind of the unique situation of just being on campus, being surrounded by people, and learning all the time, and just feeling like freshly empowered as like a young adult in the world.
Yeah, unique socioeconomically, unique culturally, unique with the fact that you are mostly surrounded by peers for the first time. It's a unique period of time, and I think one of the most important things we talked about is about how student movements are connected with other movements and how that energy translates into other movements. What would you say? So, to pivot a little bit, it's hard to exactly define what constitutes a successful student movement. What are some key tangible changes that sort of are the markers for success in sort of some of the movements that you covered?
I think that personally, I like the link between the question we just answered and this one is that the where we live, like in Canada and North America, the global North, however you want to put it, there, like being a student is kind of like the only place where like dissent is really like licensed or expected, and that also like contributes to this kind of identity of the student as like this kind of radical, and maybe they'll try being bisexual, maybe they'll like smoke some weed, maybe they'll like even like see a cop at a protest or something, and that will be their career, that will then be like nicely sort of like have a final point to it when they graduate and they'll like get a job. And I think what the like link between that and wait, what was the question that you asked again?
What makes for success
yes.
in student movements?
Sorry, I got on my little soapbox. So what makes it successful is just like kind of pushing past that, like that trajectory of something actually like persisting, and it not just being like, this is part of my identity as like kind of a reactionary because I'm young. And that can also be like, Piper and I have talked a lot about, we've interviewed different people who have said that the same movement was like a success or a failure. And, different people have different ideas about whether it was successful because it met certain demands, or it was successful just because people were dissenting in general, or because it, changed the media conversation. There's like a lot of different ways that a movement can be successful or not. But I think like, it's only in retroactively that we can point to something, and we're not even in a place where we can look back on anything that's really happened in this podcast and say that is over, and now we have a verdict about it. And I think that that's part of what activism does, is that it's always like keeping open the possibility of change of something, and that like power works by like making us think that certain histories are over and like inevitable and like not open to change anymore and have been crystallized. And I think like a success is about kind of challenging that and being like, actually we can go back to this seed, explode it open, find the people who were there or can speak to it, and like start again. So
a lot of movements take a long time, and I'm definitely reluctant to call anything a failure unless every person fighting against the issue has given up on it. Like as long as somebody's still fighting against something, I don't think it's failed. Now, whether or not it's succeeded, obviously, when tangible goals are met, we can look at that clearly and say, well, that's a success. But even then, people disagree. We look back at like 2012 or 2002, and like Sydney said, we talked to some people who refer to those as successes, and some people who think they were failures. So to me, the real success lies in just the like the perpetuity, like the ongoingness of the fight. And yeah, I think as long as people still care about something and are still fighting for it, then that's a form of success.
Yeah, but it's interesting in the series itself. A lot of the protests that you cover have very direct connections with contemporary movements as well. For instance, if we want to talk about the Computer Center riots, that's very much so connected with ongoing activism around police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as a very direct connection between 2002 and with the Netanyahu protest and the encampment protest that happened just last year. Across these threads, do you see a connection between these movements as far as like knowledges or the tactics they use? What are they doing? What has changed over the years? But also, what are some of the things that remain the same within them?
Well, I think a really common tactic that we see, a big one in the Computer Center riots, or as they're also known, the Computer Center occupation, it's kind of right there in the name, the actual occupation of space. And that was a really important one last summer with the encampment and that massive occupation of space in the summer at McGill, and that we've seen across a lot of movements, not necessarily always to that degree where it's multiple days and you're in the same building or on the field. But yeah, I think occupation of space is a big tactic, and I'm losing the thread on the rest of your question.
So to focus in on that, why is occupation so important within student movements?
Yeah, you look like do you have something to say? I can't tell.
I always have something to say, unfortunately. I think what comes to mind for that is, and this got touched on a bit today when we were talking about like the digitization of the university and how that changes what occupation looks like. But I think what occupation does is that it brings into conversation like what the relationship of a person, or in this case a student, is to the space, and it brings into conversation what right someone has to be there. And especially we saw with the encampment, like the question that was on every like CBC article or whatever was like, is the university private or public? And that's actually a really great question to have the normal layperson asking themselves, I think, is because when the response to that occupation, peaceful or not, I don't really care, is repression and police brutality and hiring like IDF soldiers as security people to like come and patrol at like night and day, then that's like bringing to light and exposing like the threat of taking up space in ways that are not considered appropriate to what should be going on in a university. And then people who maybe weren't necessarily involved in the union in the movement start to ask themselves, what is the thing that should be going on in the university, and why is this so egregious to those aims?
I think that space is also power, and we see this so clearly under capitalism. I mean, when we look at the issue of Palestine and Israel, it's the occupation of this land. And, the same thing that gives other colonial nations like Canada and the US power is the occupation of, unceded indigenous lands. And so in the same way, we can kind of turn that on its head and occupy this space and say, well, now we have this power of this space. And we're really, we're in your face. We're here. You can't deny it.
It's very interesting. I think I was at the encampment one day when the Mohawk mothers came down for the first time to announce that they were welcoming the encampment on this land, and it was very clear from the crowd there that that bore like a significant amount of weight on the radical acceptance of the protest movement itself, and yeah, just like this idea of reclaiming space as the core of occupation. How much does that have to do with bringing in other groups that can play this role of being like, hey, you are actually justified in doing what you're doing, or we stand with you, or solidarity outside to, I guess, not grant permission to occupations, but justify its place.
Yeah, I mean, I think solidarity in our movements is everything, and we see that when we look at the tuition fights, like how powerful the 2012 movement was when we had Anglo-Franco students, like, just what felt like every student from like every university, CJLO, what have you, coming together against it, and how it hasn't been as strong of a united front in the current fight against austerity and tuition hikes, and how we've seen it be a lot harder to mobilize people. Just taking that as an example, I think similarly, to like your point of the Mohawk mothers coming to the encampment, when we see where our interests are aligned, like, the occupation of people's like indigenous lands, whether it be in Palestine or Turtle Island, those movements are a lot stronger when they're standing in solidarity.
That, to me, it honestly seems like a kind of a good place to stop, because, that's where it all comes back to, and that's where it all comes from. So should we wrap up our live session? Thanks for listening. This was Discordia's 10th episode, live from Frigo Vert on Concordia campus. I'm Sydney.
I'm Piper, and thank you so much to all of our guests tonight. We were joined by Ali Salman, Juliana Smith, Angelica Antonakopoulos, I'm so sorry, Aaron Lakoff, Becca Wilgosh, and Maya Walmsley. You can hear all of them across our previous 9 episodes on the CJLO archive, SoundCloud, Spotify, or wherever you listen to radio and podcasts.